This video aims to provide context for the period of South African history that often gets referred to as the Mfecane. And by doing this, it also will provide a very brief account of the formation of the Zulu Empire. Now, this term Mfecane is a very controversial term in South African history. A lot of scholars debate about whether it happened and what were its causes, and for that reason, it's controversial. There were a lot of other events that were happening in South African history, and this would also get conflated with a lot of other issues that we'll get to in this video. So for that reason, it is controversial. But basically, it was a series of events that took place in the eastern part of South Africa during the end of the 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s. So during the late 18th century to the early 19th century. Put over here as the date 1750 to 1850, because although this period was usually seen as really taking place at the beginning of the 1800s, scholars today push it back a bit further because some of the characteristics of the Mfecane were already underway by the middle of the 18th century, or by this, in other words, the 1750s. So what exactly was this, and what does it mean, and why do we refer to this period in Southern African history as being the Mfecane? So the Mfecane refers to large-scale migrations that took place in Southern Africa amongst predominantly the Northern Nguni and Sotho-speaking people, but it sent people migrating deep into the interior. So South Africa at this stage was already occupied by various Bantu-speaking groups. The eastern part of South Africa, especially where the rainfall is much higher, is where Bantu-speaking farming societies were located, and the Northern Nguni, which would become the Zulu as this Mfecane takes place, and Sotho-speaking people were very affected by these wars and migrations that were happening at this time. The word Mfecane comes from the Nguni word for crushing, while it is known as Mfecane, which comes from the Sotho-Swana word for hammering. So obviously associated with violence and with negativity because of war, conflict, people migrating. When one chieftain went to war with another chieftain, the chieftain that lost the war, often refugees emerged, they fled and moved to other areas, but often when they moved to other areas, they came into contact with other societies and attacked them. So this period gets associated with a lot of conflict and a lot of movement of people. It began in the area between Delagoa Bay and the Tugela River. So basically in that region of South Africa, there were a number of smaller chiefdoms. During the late 1600s and the early 1700s, when ecological conditions were good, there was a lot of growth and a lot of expansion, and many people started expanding families, and you had the emergence of more and more chiefdoms. But by the end of the 1700s, there was competition for resources, for trade, for grazing, for cattle, and war between these smaller chieftains became more intensified. And what was occurring was, instead of a lot of small chiefdoms, you had larger, almost empires beginning to form themselves, or confederacies. As they conquer one chiefdom, they incorporate the people into their new, larger confederacy, then they conquer the next, and you have the emergence of a fewer, larger confederacies until you only end up with one victor at the end, and that will be the Zulu Empire. But as all these wars were taking place, other groups who could not compete with the larger confederacies that were established chose to migrate to find other areas in southern Africa. Hence, the Mfecane also gets associated with state formation. So, for example, during these wars, before Shaka emerged as the dominant force, the two dominant forces were the Induandre and the Mtetwa. The Zulu at that stage was still a small group. We'll get to how they ended up taking over. But there was another large group called the Iguane, and its king, Sobhuza, realized that he could not compete with the Mtetwa under Dingiswayo or the Induandre under Zwide. So he chose to move his people further north, found a mountainous region, settled over there, and that would eventually become the state of Eswatini. During the wars between Zwide and Shaka, who in the Zulu kingdom had already incorporated the Mthethwa under the Zulu banner. And Shaka went to war with Zwide. Eventually, Zwide's generals, as they realized that he was going to lose the wars, they chose to move much further north. So they spread this Mfecane as far north as modern-day Tanzania, Mozambique. So as as an empire was forming in the KwaZulu-Natal region, other groups migrated, went to other areas, and attacked the people living over there and created new states. So this Mfecane is a period of mass wars and empire formation that was taking place in the KwaZulu-Natal region, but its repercussions were felt as far west as what was then the British Cape Colony and as far north as what is today the states of Tanzania, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, etc. So, how did all this take place and why did all this take place? The mass migrations of the Mfecane were caused by warfare and political upheaval. These military and political upheavals also led to state formation. Many small and scattered communities became subjugated and incorporated into larger, more powerful ones. Most historians today believe that the upheavals were caused by population pressure and drought. There are various different perspectives put forward to explain the causes of the Mfecane. So there's a lot of different perspectives. We'll also touch on that during this video, but just to summarize quickly, at first, when this period was being discussed or explained and causes were being attributed to it, it was often associated with Shaka and the rise of the Zulu, or leaders like Shaka, leaders like Zwide, who wanted to conquer other groups, create an empire. So it was seen as caused by ambitious, warlike generals who wanted to conquer and spread their empire across a vast area of land. As time progressed, another group of historians began to see that as negative, see the Iguane, or the Bantu-speaking people who lived in the eastern part of South Africa, as being too warlike, and they sought to find other causes for this. So they started to look at the presence at this stage of Europeans. By this stage, the Portuguese had a trading settlement in Delagoa Bay, modern-day Mozambique. The British were stationed at the Cape, and they believed that the presence of Europeans, the trade with Europeans, so dominating trade patterns, and also slave raiding campaigns by Europeans, motivated individuals to unite the people and better able to resist slave raiding activities, or better able to take advantage of trade opportunities. Then there's another perspective that this would have been caused by population pressure and drought. During the early 1600s and the 1700s, when ecological conditions were good, there would have been population growth. The Portuguese would have introduced maize to the region, maize which they would have got from their colonial expeditions in the Americas, would do quite well in the southern African environment and would be very, very beneficial to any group of individuals that want to farm maize. It can yield a high amount of calories, relatively easy to grow, supports a larger population, but it's not as drought resistant as the types of crops that the Nguni people had been growing prior to this, sorghum and millet. So it was at a time of the late 1800s, when there were droughts, there was more population pressure. And suddenly, whereas you have these small groups competing over resources, which are becoming scarcer and scarcer on the land that's not able to support them anymore, leaders felt that if you unite these smaller groups into one state or one empire, you'd be able to better control the distribution of resources. So these are just some of the theories that get put forward to explaining the causes of the Mfecane. Basically, in a nutshell, there were, throughout these eastern parts of South Africa, a number of conflicts and wars that were occurring, and smaller groups were being incorporated into larger groups, which were emerging victorious, until you only had a few large groups. Okay, so to explain this Mfecane, it's also important to just understand the groups of people that were already living in South Africa at this stage. Now, the Khoisan, today who are referred to as the San and the Khoikhoi, the original hunter-gatherer inhabitants of South Africa, by the 1700s would have been distributed more in the western part of South Africa, where the climate is a lot drier. And at this stage, by the 1700s, they would have already been victims to European subjugation, Dutch expansion, etc. The eastern parts of South Africa were occupied by what we refer to by a linguistic grouping, so Bantu-speaking peoples, but the languages that are spoken throughout most of sub-Saharan Africa, referred to as Bantu languages, and Bantu-speaking people had already been found. There's archaeological evidence of Bantu settlements in South Africa dating back to 300 years after the Common Era, 300 CE, and these large civilizations of Mapungubwe, which have been discovered, testify to farming people distributed more in the eastern parts of South Africa because rainfall is higher. They're farming people, and hence they would obviously concentrate more in that part. Now, within Bantu-speaking societies, can divide South African population into a number of different larger groups, would be the Nguni, which would be what is today the northern Nguni in the KwaZulu-Natal area would be the Zulu, and the southern Nguni would be the Xhosa. And they live more along the coastal parts of South Africa. Further north, Sotho-Tswana, also the Venda and the Songa, who live much further north. Now, at this stage in South African history, by the 1700s, in the late 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s, there are also groups of Europeans. In 1652, the Dutch had established a settlement, but by the end of the 1700s, in 1795, the British had arrived due to wars with Napoleon. They sought to take the colony from the Dutch to fortify it against a possible French invasion. Then they came back in 1806, and then they made it a permanent British colony by 1815. And South Africa would have kind of looked like this, with the Cape Colony expanding over here and stops expanding as it comes into contact with the Amaxhosa. Up until this point, European colonial expansion had extended to where scattered groups of hunter-gatherers or pastoral people, San and Khoikhoi, were. But once they came into contact with settled farming people, expansion kind of came to a halt at this part. So by the early 1800s, this is what European expansion would have looked like. And this period called the Mfecane is occurring throughout the eastern part of South Africa, where as the various groups are fighting in the KwaZulu-Natal region and other groups are moving to escape the violence, they're trekking further into the interior and displacing or attacking other groups. And then those other groups in turn will move deeper to escape the violence and come into contact with other groups. And hence, this Mfecane often gets associated with like this period of like war that takes place, and because of all the violence, groups have to flee their homes and move elsewhere, and hence they have to leave farms behind and things like this. So it's often, as I say, associated with a lot of negativity. Now, just before we get to the actual events of the Mfecane, it's important to understand various myths and misconceptions. Now, understanding the causes of the Mfecane and the actual events are a bit tricky because of sources. The people who experienced this did not keep written records. They recorded history through oral traditions. And the people who did write about this were often Europeans observing as outsiders to events they didn't fully understand. So therefore, there is a lot of conflicting stories about specific details. Like, for example, when we get to Zulu Kazi and why Zulu Kazi left KwaZulu-Natal and went further north, there's various different oral traditions. One said that he had a conflict with Shaka when he refused to give Shaka cattle tribute from a tribe that he had raided. And there's another story about why he moved. So there is that dilemma. But basically, understanding the causes present major challenges for historians. It is a controversial term, and the events and causes are shrouded in mystery. One of the challenges understanding the causes of migrations and wars are the absence of written sources. Oral traditions are liable to change, especially when a chiefdom is destroyed. Its stories are destroyed with it. History is often told by the victors. There are few written accounts which were written by Christian missionaries, but they contain their own biases. So when putting the story together, you often get the story passed down from the perspectives of those who had emerged as the victors. So you'll get the perspectives of the Zulu, for example, but the many groups that would have been conquered, their traditions would have probably died as their chieftain was incorporated into a, like the victorious Zulu, for example. Or with the case of these missionaries who are observing, they're observing as outsiders, and they also have their own motives. So this is influencing. So that's part of the reason that this term is a bit controversial, and it gets disputed about what exactly are the causes. Was it the presence of Europeans? Was it because it was an African way of dealing with the ecological factors that led to state formation? Was it caused because of ambitious individuals like Shaka and Zwide? The debate continues. Okay, but also just something to take note as well, which will also get into this event, is what's important to understand is when this Mfecane is really taking place, the groups, as the various groups are leaving KwaZulu-Natal to escape the violence that's occurring over there, or the confederacy that can no longer compete with the victorious confederacy migrates westward. There's another migration taking place at this point in time, and that happens from the 1834 onwards, when the British abolish slavery at the Cape. And in 1834, the British abolished slavery at the Cape. One of many factors that some of the Boer inhabitants of the Cape. So the Dutch had established a settlement in 1652. From that period, 1652 until 1795, when the British first arrived, different groups of Europeans had arrived at that Cape, and they got accustomed to a specific way of lifestyle under Dutch law. When the British arrived and started anglicizing things and passing their own laws and doing their own things, a lot of the Dutch did not like this, or I wouldn't say Dutch, they're Boers, because their ancestries would come from different parts of Europe like France and Germany. But they began to trek into the interior as well. So as the Voortrekkers, as they became known as, moved eastward into South Africa, there were various Bantu-speaking groups that were moving westward. And this facilitated what would become known as the myth of the empty land, where during this period of European colonialism in Southern Africa, the first European historians who began to write the history of the region began to write it as if this was vacant land that two different groups, Bantu-speaking and Europeans, began to occupy at more or less the same time, and it was used to justify apartheid. Part of the reason the Mfecane is so controversial, because in spite of the fact that there are Bantu-speaking settlements in South Africa that date back over 1,000 years ago, it was because of the migrations that were caused by the Mfecane, an opportunity to come up with myths of white and black settlement of the land at the same time. And during the apartheid period, this myth surrounding the Mfecane was used as a justification for the apartheid's Bantu stance, the idea that this is where different tribes of Africans had settled during this Mfecane. Okay, so during the 1700s, it's argued that Bantu-speaking societies living on the southeast coast had experienced growth with relative peace and stability. However, by the end of the 1700s, population pressure was increasing, and this caused massive cases of violent upheavals. So when ecological conditions during the early 1700s were good and there was population growth, there were instances of conflict, but these were small. So you might have two Nguni-speaking societies, they might have a small dispute, they'd have a war where they throw a few spears and one side would emerge as the victor and the dispute would be settled. But by the end of 1700s, as there's scarcity for resources, for grazing land, and these conflicts are becoming much more intensified, and suddenly it's not about settling small disputes. One group conquers the other group and becomes larger and incorporates its people, creates a larger chiefdom, makes alliances with neighbors or conquers neighbors, and the wars are getting much more intensified until by the beginning of the 1800s, these violent upheavals had led to the emergence of four large kingdoms: the Induandre under Zwide, the Mtetwa under Dingiswayo, the Iguane under Sobuza, and the Boabe. Now the these were basically the four different kingdoms. However, even before that, there were already instances of similar things happening further north. So what we just spoke about is what we usually associate with the Mfecane, the rise of the Zulu that happened in modern-day KwaZulu-Natal. But even as far as Delagoa Bay in modern-day Mozambique, the Mabudu and Tembe were subjugating and incorporating or displacing smaller units, and its repercussions were felt even amongst the Pedi, which are much deeper in what would later be known as the Transvaal, deep into the interior of South Africa. So even further north, this thing of smaller groups being displaced and incorporated into larger groups was already occurring. And meanwhile, in KwaZulu-Natal, at the end of the 18th century, the chief of the Mthethwa, Job, died, and his son in exile returned and took over the kingdom. So prior to what we just spoke about that happened in KwaZulu-Natal, further north, monopoly of the trade, the Mabudu and the Tembe were emerging, and further south in KwaZulu-Natal, the two big groups, the Mthethwa and the Induandre, will eventually compete with one another for a monopoly to trade with the groups further north who are trading directly with the Portuguese. Now, the Mthethwa were led by their king Job, and he had sent one of his sons, Dingiswayo, into exile. And at the end of the 1700s, when he died, Dingiswayo returned and took over the Mthethwa back and became the leader of the Mthethwa. The conflict between the Induandre and the Mthethwa. Now, the Induandre and the Mthethwa are going to emerge as the two biggest forces. Oabe will be located, and they will eventually sign a alliance with Shaka and the Zulu later on. But the Iguane is going to realize that they're not able to compete with the Mthethwa and the Induandre. The Induandre were conquering surrounding villages and incorporating them into their own. In this way, it grew and became increasingly more powerful. The fiercest rival to Zwide's Induandre was the Mthethwa Dingiswayo. The other large kingdom in the area, Sobhuza of the Iguane, was eventually driven away by the Induandre. His father had established the Iguane. They were pretty much solidified, but during Sobhuza's reign, he lost a battle to the Induandre, and he realized that it's only a matter of time before he gets conquered. So he decided it's in his own best interest to move further north. Sobhuza eventually fled to the region now known as Swaziland or Eswatini. In Eswatini, he began subjugating the existing Nguni and Sotho-speaking communities and incorporating them into his own kingdom. His successor, Mswati, is where the word Swazi for Eswatini or Swaziland came from. So this is an example of a state which is formed as a consequence of the Mfecane. So the conflict that's taking place in what is today KwaZulu-Natal, because of these emergence of the powerful Induandre and the powerful Mthethwa, one group who are also powerful but not as powerful as the other two decided to move, found a different region, conquered the people there, incorporated them into his kingdom, and created his own state of Eswatini. Another branch of the Iguane, under Matiwane, similar predicament, but he chose to move westward and moved more to the Drakensberg region, and then he attacked a group called the Hlubi and killed their king, Mtinkulu. The Hlubi dispersed, and Matiwane settled in the territory, incorporating the smaller groups. So another instance of how this kind of conflict that's originating is getting intensified in the KwaZulu-Natal region. But as more ruthless techniques of combat emerge over there, and the people who are hardened by this type of warfare, they move and they go to other areas which are not experiencing such warfare, so they usually have an advantage. So the Iguane move westward, they come into contact with another group, the Hlubi, they kill their leader, and the Hlubi fragment. A group of them assemble under a new leader, and they move westward. A lot of the refugees move south, and they'll become known as the Mbenga. They'll go into the Xhosa territory, and some of the Hlubi will be incorporated into the Iguane. But as the Hlubi disperse, they're going to come into contact with other groups like the Tlokwa, which we'll also get to now. With the Iguane out the way, the stage was set for a clash between the Mtetwa and the Induandre. Dingiswayo established the Amabutu, which is age regiments, which proved very successful, enabling him to easily defeat his neighbors and incorporate them into his confederacy. Again, because of all this wars that are taking place in the KwaZulu-Natal region, the leaders here are devising new methods of fighting, new methods of discipline in the army, making the army more regimented. And all of them are competing with one another. So in an instance where the Iguane move either north to establish Eswatini or west to displace the Hlubi, the techniques that they're using in this area, they're taking to other areas and using it to conquer those people. Zwide was more ferocious than Dingiswayo. While the Mtetwa experienced some success, its leader Dingiswayo was eventually captured by Zwide in 1818 and murdered. Now, Zwide, he had been leader of this very, very powerful Mtetwa confederacy, which ruled over a number of smaller groups. And one of the groups that he ruled over would have been a small group, numbered about 1,500, known as the Zulu. Their king, Senzakakona, had a son with a woman who he refused to recognize, so the son would not be the king. Her name was Nandi, the son's name was Shaka. But due to his issues with Nandi, he had sent her into exile. She lived briefly with her tribe, the Ilangeni, and they also eventually moved to the Mtetwa with her son Shaka. Dingiswayo and Shaka would have had a very good relationship. Dingiswayo would have been impressed with Shaka. Shaka was a brave, dedicated soldier, very ingenious when it comes to coming up with different strategies. And for these reasons, he would have when he found out that Shaka was son of Senzakakona, another group that fell under his confederacy, he would empower Shaka to be king. In fact, Senzakakona, when Nandi was pregnant with Shaka, refused to recognize the fact that she was pregnant, and the fact the word Shaka means intestinal beetle, or a word to refer to the fact that he didn't see her as really being pregnant, but rather like infected with the beetle. So that's where the word Shaka comes from. But basically, he refused to acknowledge that. But when Senzakakona died, with Dingiswayo's support, Shaka was able to assert himself as king of the Zulu. But at that stage, Shaka would have been loyal to Dingiswayo and remained part of the Mtetwa Confederacy. But in 1818, when Dingiswayo was murdered, Shaka chose to reunite the Mtetwa Confederacy. After the death of its leader, the large and powerful Mtetwa Confederacy became fragmented and fell into disarray. Shaka, son of King Senzakakona, king of a small tribe called the Zulu, used the opportunity to take over the Mtetwa. So he began to reconquer the confederacy that made up the Mtetwa and made it now the Zulu. Shaka was one of Dingiswayo's most valuable military men. With Dingiswayo's help, Shaka had actually become the king of the Zulus. After Dingiswayo's death, Shaka then began reconquering and uniting all the rival factions and of the Mtetwa and rebuilt it. So now Shaka has united, and he's also signed a treaty with Iguane, and he has emerged as a very powerful force, and he's going to come into conflict with the other most powerful force, which is the Induandre. Shaka managed to join forces with a former rival between the White and Mfolozi River and the Tugela River. Zwide's first attack with Shaka's Zulu was unsuccessful. Zwide attacked again. This time Shaka came up with the strategy of drawing Induandre forces deeper and deeper into the Tugela region until they were overextended. It's also a major battle in Koili Hill, where Shaka assembled a much smaller force of Zulus on a hill and a larger force of the Induandre. As they climbed the hills, Shaka used a good tactic of defeating the Induandre. And this huge defeat at the hands of the Zulu would cause internal fragmentation amongst the Induandre, because the Induandre, those who were under Zwide's leadership, would have been loyal to Zwide. But after seeing Shaka's forces defeat the Induandre, his rigid rule over his people began to fragment, and generals would break away. Then his forces attacked and sent the Induandre into withdrawal. This added to what might have already been internal fragmentation of the Induandre. So, two of Zwide's generals are now, after the defeat at the Zulus, are going to decide that they're not, just like Sobhuza had left to escape the Induandre, they're going to leave this KwaZulu-Natal region to escape Shaka. The Gaza and Jele kingdoms. Two of Zwide's chiefs, Shoshagan, who represented the Gaza house of the Ndebele, and Zwangindaba, who represented the Jele house, broke away. They both traveled north, first to Delagoa Bay and then further north. Shoshagan eventually established the Gaza kingdom along the Nkomati River in what is today southern Mozambique. Zwangindaba moved further west into Zimbabwe, then further north into southern Zambia, central Malawi, and southern Tanzania. So they had moved further north. First, Shoshagan established a settlement near Delagoa Bay, but he was going to be attacked by the Zulus, so he moved it further north into southern Mozambique. Zwangindaba would come into conflict with Shoshagan, so he decided to move his new kingdom further north, and it would become the Ngoni kingdom. Now, the actual general of the Induandre, or the actual leader of the Induandre, two of his generals went further north and established states. Zwide, on the other hand, he did not have the same luck, the demise of the Induandre. Zwide had less luck. He went to Swaziland and attacked supporters from smaller groupings. He died in 1824, and his son assumed the leadership of the Induandre. However, in 1826, Shaka attacked at the Battle of Pongolo River, and the Induandre were crushed. Some members of the Induandre joined the Zulu, some moved further north and joined Shoshagan's Gaza kingdom, and a few joined Zulu Kazi's Ndebele. Now, who was Zulu Kazi? Zulu Kazi was another one of these individuals. He was leading the Khumalo clan in KwaZulu-Natal. The reasons that he left, but disputed due to conflicting oral sources. But basically, he had a fallout. Well, first, his father would have been part of the Induandre Confederacy. His father was put to death by Zwide, believing that Zulu Kazi's father was disloyal. Zulu Kazi became the new king of his Khumalo clan, but then when Shaka defeated Zwide, he pledged his loyalty to Shaka, but as time progressed, a bit of a dispute, he decided to leave. So in 1821, Zulu Kazi of the Khumalo clan clashed with his ally Shaka. To escape a retaliation by the Zulu, he migrated over the escarpment to the Highveld with a small band of warriors. They settled in the Transvaal and became known as the Ndebele. The British called them Matabele, derived from the Sotho word for Ndebele. So they were part of the Khumalo clan in modern-day KwaZulu-Natal, Nguni-speaking people. As they came into contact with Sothos referred to them by a word that they would use to refer to as strangers, called Matabele, and hence that name ended up sticking, and today we refer to Zulu Kazi's people as the Ndebele. Since Zulu Kazi was trained in Shaka's methods of warfare, he easily conquered several Sotho and Tswana chieftains. His enemies either fled or incorporated into his Ndebele. Shaka, because again he was a product of this conflict that took place in KwaZulu-Natal, he had devised very advanced techniques of combat, and one of them was he was frustrated. Well, he didn't was frustrated, but he saw the flaws of the old ways of fighting. Two armies assembled with long spears which they throw at one another and hope to hit. Instead, he shortened the spear, lengthened the length of the blade, called it the Ikwa because he believed that's the sound that it made when you pulled it out of someone's body. But he changed warfare and he came up with this bullhorns formation where you would have the army organized into different units, two horns, young guys who would try to encircle the enemy. The main thrust, the chest, would go straight at the enemy while the horns encircle the enemy to stop them from running away, and then the chest would crush the enemy. Right at the back would be the loins. They would serve as reserves. Apparently they would have their backs facing the battle and would only be allowed to see what's going on if they were called upon to assist. So these techniques were very effective, and hence people who were leaving KwaZulu-Natal and learned these techniques would take them with them and further north and use it to conquer other groups. And Zulu Kazi became very troublesome to the groups that he came into contact with. Tswana groups that were living in the region that Zulu Kazi is now going. He's now attacking them, incorporating them, sending refugees, and they have to move. One of the Sotho groups that the Ndebele attacked was the Kololo, who fled northwards from the Highveld and eventually founded a kingdom in modern-day Zambia. So another example of a state that gets founded much further north. Meanwhile, in the southwest foot of the Drakensberg, when the Hlubi were displaced by Matuane's Iguane, they crossed the Drakensberg and attacked the Tlokwa, which was under Matatisi. So, again, we said that there were two branches of the Iguane. One went and established Eswatini, the other went to the Drakensberg area and attacked the Hlubi. The Hlubi, some of them went to the Amaxhosa land as Mfengu refugees. Some were incorporated into Matuane's Iguane, but a few of them assembled under a new chief, and they moved further west and attacked a Sotho group called the Tlokwa that was ruled by a Queen Matatisi. Her husband had died, and she was ruling under the name of her son, who was still too young to rule at that stage. The three groups, the Iguane, the Hlubi, and the Tlokwa, would live in tension, occupying the Caledon Valley region around the Caledon River. The Tlokwa eventually defeated the Hlubi and incorporated them into their Tlokwa and became much larger. Others fled into Amaxhosa land, would join the Mfengu. Some joined Matuane, and the others, as I said, would be part of the Mfengu, and they would be settled in the Butterworth area of what is today the Eastern Cape. In 1822, tensions in the Caledon Valley area resulted in refugees who fled. Various groups of the Swana, the Puting, the Tong, the Foking, and the Klakwana moved westward, affecting the southern Swana. The Hloling and the Hlaping were victims of raids from 1823 to 1826. The Foking under Sepetwana established the Kololo Kingdom in modern-day Western Zambia. So it also affected Swana. Now the Swana, at this stage, at about the time that the Mfecane was taking place, they were already in much smaller units distributed. So when these individuals or these other tribes came into their area, it was very devastating. So this in a nutshell is a map that shows some of what was occurring during this Mfecane. So as the large four powerful empires emerge over here, mainly the last two, the Mtetwa and the Induandre, the Dlamini branch of the Iguane move further north, establish the Eswatini, Swaziland as it becomes known as. The other branch moves west, they attack the Hlubi attack the Tlokwa attack other groups flee, and this conflict from here spreads. Zulu Kazi, he goes further north and further north. Eventually, as this is happening, the four trekkers who are leaving the Cape, the white settlers who are now trekking to the interior to establish new states to escape British rule, they will align themselves with a lot of the Swana victims of the Ndebele, Zulu Kazi's forces, unite with them and attack the Ndebele, and then the Ndebele will move further north to modern-day Zimbabwe. Another leader to take note of at this time would be Mshweshwe, and he was a Sotho, and during this time of upheavals and warfare that was occurring, he sought to take a lot of the refugees and offer them protection, and he created his own kingdom on a hill, Thabo Busu, which is located in modern-day Lesotho. And he established a state over here, which he was able to protect and offer protection for many of the refugees, and created his own state. And gradually, as time went on, and to seek protection against the four trekkers as they were moving, he would eventually sign a deal with the British, and they would establish a protectorate over his nation, the Basotho, which would become known as Lesotho today. So in a quick nutshell, if we look at a map, we can see the different examples of states that have been formed as a consequence of the Mfecane. You can see the Zulu, the Ndebele, the Gaza kingdom, the Ngoni kingdom, the Kololo, Lesotho, and Swaziland, which are just some states.